This is BBC News. I'm Laxmi Gopal. Your headlines. President Trump has begun a trip to Scotland, combining his passion for golf with European Union trade talks. He said there was a 50-50 chance of a trade deal. Israel's military says lessons have been learnt after it acknowledged harm was inflicted on Palestinian civilians at aid distribution points. The IDF was responding to a BBC interview with a whistleblower who said he'd never seen such indiscriminate brutality against civilians. Cross-border fighting between Thailand and Cambodia is continuing for a third day. The Thai military says that the Cambodians attacked in a new area near the coast in the south, but were pushed back. And England manager Sarina Wiegman speaks ahead of the Euro 2025 final as the Lionesses gear up to face Spain on Sunday.
Now, on BBC News, from myth to modernity, Tom Brooke explores the evolution of Irish cinema through its most iconic films. Another chance to see some Irish cinema classics in Talking Movies.
I have great respect for Irish cinema, but how does one define an Irish film? Is it a picture that tells a uniquely Irish story, or one that places Irish talent in front of or behind the camera? Or is it a bit of both? I've come to Ireland to find out.
I think, no matter where we are, we tell stories. For us, stories is who we are and what we are, and I think having our own cinema is who we are.
There is a thriving Irish movie industry, and sometimes they come up with little gems. The best thing that I've seen in recent times has been a small Irish language movie called On Colleen Kuhn, The Quiet Girl, which ended up at the Oscars.
The Banshees of Inisherin. But it's nice to see your own country being in a movie, and it was like such a big movie as well.
The Quiet Man. I think at the time it was very prestigious to have Hollywood actors over in a place like Cannes in Mayo. So yeah, it was a good movie.
The Quiet Man was made for an American audience. It's historically interesting, but you'd have to tie me down if you wanted to make me watch it.
This is my first visit to Dublin in more than 40 years. It's my chance to find out more about some classic Irish films, movies that have reverberated around the world, and meet some people who know a lot about them.
And who better to show me around the city and guide me through Ireland's film classics than my Dublin-born Talking Movies colleague, Alan Maloney.
Hey, Al, how you doing?
Tom, how's it going?
Yeah, good to see you.
Our first stop, Trinity College Dublin, in the heart of the city.
You were here as an undergraduate, is that right?
That's true. I feel very old now, but I did English and history at the time, so exactly 20 years ago I left. But, I mean, a lot of films have been filmed here over the years and TV shows, so if it looks a bit familiar, this is kind of front square. And if you've seen the film Educating Rita...
Oh, with Michael Caine and Julie Walters.
Yeah, Oscar-nominated film. This was actually the university that they used for it. And the big Paul Mescal TV show, Normal People, was also filmed here, kind of set in Trinity. But my favourite fact is that the library that's here served as the inspiration for the Jedi Library in the Star Wars prequels, which is, it's quite a fun thing that your library exists in a galaxy far, far away. So it's been used as a location throughout kind of the last number of decades.
Well, Al, that's good to hear. I'm off to see someone who knows a lot about a classic Irish film called The Quiet Man, made in 1952. Her name is Dr. Ruth Barton, and she's a professor in film studies here at Trinity.
The film is about Sean Thornton, a returned Irish immigrant who comes back to Ireland. He's recovering from the trauma of having killed a man in a boxing ring. He falls in love with the Irish Colleen. She won't marry him because she can't get her dowry until various other circumstances are sorted out.
What did you say her name was?
Mary Kate Danaher. And don't be getting any notions into your head.
In the end, in order to win his bride, he has to fight her brother.
Oh, get out! Why, if he was the last man on the face of this earth and my sister the last woman, I'd still say no.
Now, just a minute.
If it's a question of the girl's fortune, fortune?
This is a film about somebody's fantasy, which is the returned American's fantasy. John Ford is one of Ireland's famous emigrant sons, so both his parents were from the west of Ireland. Both his parents had emigrated, but he'd always had this dream of returning to Ireland and making what he called his Irish romance.
When the film was released in 1952, was it received differently here in Ireland as compared to the United States?
There was quite a lot of anxiety behind the scenes in government quarters about the image of Ireland that this film would project, because Ireland at that stage was just beginning to modernise. It was just trying to move away from that old peasant image to become seen as a more modern country. And so they were worried that it would portray Ireland as this country of backward peasants who only like to drink and fight.
That's a what?
I said that's a lie.
That's a word I take from no man!
And how about film scholars like yourself in Ireland today? How do they view the film?
I tell you what, it's a hard sell in the classroom. They are horrified by the stereotypes which they take seriously and are offended by.
How would it be if I put one of me fists in my pocket?
But it's the treatment of Maureen O'Hara that really gets them, because there are multiple ways of seeing this film. One is that she's a strong woman. She's standing up for what she's entitled to, which is her dowry.
Well, a fine opinion he must have of me if he thinks I'd go to any man without a proper fortune.
She does not succumb to the first man who sweeps her off her feet, but they see the sequence where he drags her through the fields and they go, violence against women, this is appalling, and I don't blame them.
Here's a good stick to beat the lovely lady.
Thanks.
Every time you discuss Irish cinema, you seem to come back to The Quiet Man. This was the image of Ireland that most people thought of when they thought of Ireland. It sets up that set of images, and successive filmmakers have responded to that. It really starts with Neil Jordan and Jim Sheridan in the late 80s, where you get the first real flowering of Irish cinema, films like My Left Foot, The Crying Game, In the Name of the Father, and these are films that interrogated Irish society and in particular looked at the legacy of nationalism, the fight around Northern Ireland, and also inequality and social issues. These are films that really concern themselves with what is happening in Ireland now, rather than painting that sort of glowing picture of Irish life, which is the real sort of American fantasy.
Well, Al, The Quiet Man was released in 1952. That's quite a long time ago. How much do people refer to it nowadays here in Ireland?
I have to say, it's not a film that people would talk about or have in the national conversation. If anything, it kind of feels like it's from a bygone era.
Well, one of my favourite Irish pictures is a bit more contemporary. It was released in 1992, and it's The Crying Game, written and directed by Neil Jordan. The Crying Game, at its heart, is a romantic thriller, and it's set, to begin with at least, in Northern Ireland. And you have Stephen Rea playing an IRA member who is a fleshed-out character. He's not a heartless IRA gunman, and he has in his charge a British soldier who's been taken hostage. He's being held for ransom.
Thank you, handsome. My pleasure.
That soldier, played by Forrest Whitaker, tells him that he has a lover called Dill, and that should anything happen to him, because he knows he's probably going to get shot, executed, so to speak, would Stephen Rea's character, who's called Fergus, go and take care of his lover? Well, to cut a long story short, he does end up getting killed, and Fergus goes to London, meets Dill, is actually quite taken by Dill, and then to his amazement, he finds out that Dill is a transgender woman. I think what made The Crying Game so interesting is that for its time, 1992, it dealt with a lot of forbidden images. For one thing, images of the IRA were strictly regulated in the British media. As journalists, we could not interview them, or we had to go to great lengths to interview them.
The situation is simple. Your
being held hostage by the Irish Republican Army.
So you didn't really see that many IRA characters, real or fictionalized, and also to see a transgender character in those days was really unusual. The way in which we found out that Dill, the transgender character, was transgender was seen as a huge, huge twist. It was actually more of a horror show than anything sympathetic to transgender people.
You want me to ask you in, right?
They're about to get intimate. Fergus sees that this is a transgender woman that he's with.
You did know, didn't you?
At that point, he pushes her away, rushes into the bathroom and starts throwing up in a rather loud way, vomiting, because he's seen a transgender individual, or at least he realized he's been attracted to one.
What were you doing in the bar if you didn't know?
Attitudes towards transgender people have changed over the years, and I think a lot of trans people are not happy, not just trans people, but people who are thoughtful, should I say, are not happy with the way in which the transgender revelation took place in the film.
I should have known, shouldn't I?
Probably.
Kind of wish I didn't.
You can always pretend.
But there is one thing I would like to say, that people may have misgivings about this film now, but essentially it's a love story. It's about Stephen Ray's character, a man who doesn't really know himself in many ways, who finds out that he's attracted to a transgender woman, and there is a love relationship that develops. So I think more than anything else, it is a story about love. And of course, love always emerges in the most unlikely of places in life, and this film is a representation of that.
What's that about? They're jealous.
I look at the film and I think this is really a brilliant independent film. It's one of the best art independent films of the 1990s. Well, The Crying Game was shot in Northern Ireland and London, not here, Al, in Dublin. But at that time, there were a number of films that came out that really did make good use of Dublin as a location, weren't there?
Definitely, and I think the first film that comes to mind is everybody will think of The Commitments, which really showed the working class Dublin, kind of a different side than people maybe had seen before. And also with that, there was another Roddy Doyle adaptation as well called The Snapper, which people maybe outside Ireland haven't heard as much about, but is still kind of equally loved here.
I really like The Snapper as well, and it was actually directed by an outsider, Stephen Frears, but it's very much an Irish film, an Irish story, and it happens also to be a favourite film of Yvonne Murray, who is Dublin-born, a former BBC News journalist, and now a reporter for the Irish broadcaster RTE.
The Snapper is the story of 20-year-old Sharon Curley, who lives in this fictitious Dublin suburb called Barrytown. The plot hinges on one day Sharon discovers that she's pregnant. And what follows is the drama that engulfs her family and her community as she comes to terms with the pregnancy.
You're pregnant, you said?
Yeah.
That's lovely, that is.
It depicts a time in Ireland when we were going through profound social change. I remember seeing magazines where there were whole pages blacked out, censored by the church and the state, presumably information about our reproductive rights that the church and the state felt that we shouldn't see. So here we are in 1993, where we have a very different Ireland, a modernising Ireland, where we have Sharon Curley, who gets pregnant outside of marriage, but she keeps the baby. And yes, she goes on to suffer the shame and the humiliation and the gossip that was so commonplace in small communities in Ireland.
Shirley, come here, listen. You know you're
But this change is reflected in the script.
I think we should tell them that it's better to be married if you're pregnant.
Oh, whatever you think yourself, Kay, you know? I mean, I'm only their dad. They'll only laugh at me. Times have changed.
And this is a nod to the changes that are going on socially. As young women growing up in this changing Ireland, we felt uncomfortable watching The Snapper because it's very funny, it's very warm, and it's hilarious because, of course, it's Roddy Doyle who wrote the book. But the main incident in this film is really the story of a sexual assault. And I remember going to see the film and feeling very uncomfortable but perhaps not having the ability to articulate why I felt like that. I think what's very heartwarming about this film is that it celebrates an Irish community coming together around an issue that previously would have been seen as a huge scandal. In the end, she has so much support around her, and that's really represented in the final scene where she gives birth to the Snapper. And her family burst in and they're all overjoyed because it's a new generation, it's a new life. I think what the Snapper tells us about where we are in the arc of Irish storytelling that comes through Irish cinema is we were suddenly at a point in the 1990s when we were beginning to ask questions about how our society was changing, how we spoke about community, how we spoke about womanhood, how we spoke about families. And I think what's so refreshing about Roddy Doyle's stories set in this fictional Dublin suburb of Barrytown is that these are our stories.
Coming up in Talking Movies, more classic Irish cinema, including the Banshees of Inisherin and the low-budget Irish film Once. Welcome back to Talking Movies as we find out more about classic Irish cinema. And joining me once again is my trusted Talking Movies colleague, Alan Maloney. Al, this is your hometown Dublin, and we're right in the middle of the city centre, aren't we?
That's true. We're in a place called Grafton Street, which is kind of one of the main shopping centres in the heart of Dublin.
And this location is key to one of your favourite Irish films, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is a key location. It's in John Carney's Oscar-winning film Once. The plot of Once, it's actually really simple. It's about a busker in Dublin. He's singing, and one night he happens to meet a Czech worker, a Czech immigrant, and they bond over their shared love of music.
This song you just played, you wrote it?
Working on it.
And it's a really heartwarming story. It's almost kind of like a simple kind of fable. They're each missing something in their life, and then they help each other.
This is my daughter, Ivanka. Come on.
It's a very, very low-budget film. I think the budget at the time was about $125,000. And if you look at the film, you can kind of see a lot of it is long lenses, a lot of it is them just rocking up to locations and filming. There's films in buses and films here in Grafton Street where, you know, passerby, random people are just getting in the way of shot.
In love with an Irish girl, she took my heart.
There's obviously the very famous scene, which is of the Oscar-winning song, which is Falling Slowly. And it starts with Guy and Girl, who are the names of the characters, and they go into a music shop, and he sits at a guitar and she sits at a piano. And the song kind of comes together and it builds. And it's this moment where you kind of see instant chemistry on screen.
2, 3, 4. I don't know you, but I want you.
In one respect, you could have once in kind of any city in the world. But on another level, the characters feel Irish, and in particular Dublin. And a lot of it is located in Grafton Street, where you have this culture of singing outdoors and singing for an audience. And it feels very much like an Irish film in terms of people using songs and people using language and stories to communicate. I think it was the sign of a maturing film industry. You need low-budget films, you need independent films. You can't just rely on big-budget films to come in. And so I think it's a sign of a maturing industry when you can make those films yourself, and then when you can promote them and they go down well with an Irish audience, but then they go down well as well with kind of a worldwide audience.
In 2023, Ireland earned a record 14 Oscar nominations, and 9 of those went to writer-director Martin McDonagh's The Banshees of Inisherin. That picture happens to be a favourite of Dublin-born BBC presenter Martha Kearney.
Colm? Are you coming out to the pub, Colm? It's 2 o'clock, like.
The Banshees of Inisherin. It's such a hugely original, funny, complex film. I really loved it. The plot is about 2 men who are best friends. It's set in 1923 in a remote island off the west coast of Ireland. They go to the pub every night and enjoy pints together, and then something goes wrong in their friendship. And for one of them, the character played by Colin Farrell, he just can't work out why this friendship, which is at the centre of his life, has been shattered.
Brother, what are you doing home?
I knocked on Colm's sonny Larry, who's just sitting there.
Sitting there doing what?
Sitting there doing nothing.
The really clever thing about The Banshees of Inisherin is the way that it begins in a very soft, lyrical, almost cliched view. There's a rainbow in the first scene, but as it goes on, and you know this if you've seen any Martin McDonagh films, it's going to be brutal and savage and dark, and that's what happens in the course of the film. It's a film that takes a number of stereotypes about Irish rural life and turns them on the head. I mean, I've got an Irish friend who hates it, but the way Martin McDonagh writes about it, he subverts all of that.
It isn't him you have impure thoughts about, is it?
Are you joking me?
For me, one of the really clever things about this film is the way it picks the theme of political violence, which has blighted so much of Irish history, and does it in such a subtle way. We're hearing the guns, we're hearing fighting, which is the Irish Civil War. And it's subtly woven through the film.
Good luck to you. Whatever it is you're fighting about.
It was a very bloody time. I know myself from having covered the Troubles in Northern Ireland for so long, how atrocities lead to other atrocities, and sometimes the ideological motivation for them has disappeared, and it becomes as simple but as deep-rooted as revenge, and that happens again and again, and it gets passed down through generations.
Well, it was so much easier when we was all on the same side and it was just the English we was killing. I think it was. I preferred it.
Al, I've certainly learned a lot about Irish cinema. Thanks so much for showing me around. And we started our programme actually with the film made in 1952, The Quiet Man, and things have changed a lot in the industry since then, haven't they?
I think so, and I think it's great to see the Irish industry maturing. It's no longer relying on kind of outside voices. It's now Irish people telling Irish stories. You've still got the big blockbusters, but it's also kind of gaining ownership and independence of their own industry, which is great to see.
It's nice to see a self-confidence that Irish people have always been great storytellers. They certainly have technical expertise with film now, and they're getting their stories out there in the Irish language. We saw that with The Quiet Girl, which got an Oscar nomination a couple of years ago. So it's very heartening to see, and I hope it continues.
Fingers crossed.
Well, that's all from Talking Movies here in Dublin, where we've been looking at classic Irish cinema. We're going to leave you with the Oscar-winning Falling Slowly from the Irish film Once, which happens to be one of Al's favourite films. So, goodbye.
Take this sinking boat and point it home. We've still got time. Raise your hopeful voice. You had the choice. You made it now.
In a 24-hour news cycle, patience can be so frustrating, but it's a crucial tool. I don't rush to be the first. I strive to get it right. I'm Lucy Hockings on BBC News Now.
Live from London, this is BBC News. Israel's plan to allow foreign aid airdrops into Gaza is met with criticism and scepticism. A UN agency says it will not reverse the deepening starvation in the Strip. The UNRWA chief calls the announcement a distraction, with as many as 90,000 women and children needing urgent treatment for malnourishment. President Trump is in Scotland. For a short visit, he's due to meet Sir Keir Starmer and Scotland's First Minister John Swinney in the coming days. But first, it's all about the golf. This is seen live at the President's Turnberry course, where he's been playing under very tight security. The Lionesses are gearing up to defend their Euros title. They take on Spain in the final in Basel on Sunday. Hello, I'm Karen Giannoni. The head of the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, says airdrops alone won't reverse what it calls the deepening starvation in Gaza. The World Food Programme warns that 90,000 women and children are in urgent need of treatment. Israel says foreign nations will be allowed to provide airdrops in the coming days, with the UK confirming it's working on a plan in partnership with Jordan. But in a social media post, UNRWA's Philippe Lazzarini warns that airdrops are expensive, inefficient and can even kill starving civilians, describing them as a distraction and a smokescreen. With mounting international concern, the Gaza Health Ministry says another baby died today from severe malnutrition and a lack of milk formula. Palestinian health officials also say airstrikes and shootings have killed at least another 25 people, mostly as they sought food. Médecins Sans Frontières project coordinator in Gaza City, Caroline Willman, told the BBC restarting airdrops isn't enough, as well as posing its own risks.
Based on what we see, the very many malnourished patients that we have, there is for sure a desperate need for more aid to come in. Then if you think about the fact that there's 2 million people in the Gaza Strip right now desperate for food, it seems to me that airdrops might be something that helps, but it seems insufficient. On top of that, my concern would be as well, given the level of desperation that people have when you drop food from the sky like this, how will people get access to it? How would a single mother get access to that? Because obviously everybody's desperate. Everybody will go towards these places where food is dropped, and only the strongest, of which, let's be honest, everybody here is hungry. Everybody here should get access to aid, but the most vulnerable might not be able to access it because it will be a very chaotic scene.
The BBC's Middle East correspondent Hugo Bashega is in Jerusalem and says multiple aid groups have criticised those airdrop plans, calling them insufficient and a dangerous way of getting aid into Gaza.
We haven't had any kind of official announcement yet by the Israeli authorities' confirmation of when these aid drops might happen. But this Israeli announcement has been dismissed by the United Nations as a distraction. We've heard concerns there from Doctors Without Borders, aid organizations, saying that this way of delivering aid, of getting aid to people in Gaza is not only insufficient but also very risky, because you could have chaos, you could have violence, and some incidents there in Gaza. And I think what we're hearing here is that the United Nations, aid organizations, and a number of countries are saying that this crisis in Gaza is the result of the restrictions on the entry and distribution of aid that have been imposed by the Israeli authorities. Now, Israel dismisses the allegations, despite the overwhelming evidence that its policies are behind what we're seeing right now in Gaza, that a very limited amount of aid is getting in, and what is there is not reaching everyone. And what aid agencies are saying is that the only way to ease the crisis in Gaza, a worsening humanitarian crisis there, is by allowing the unrestricted entry and distribution of aid in the territory. And this is likely to only happen when there is a ceasefire deal in place. We know that these latest negotiations efforts have failed to reach a deal, so I don't think there is any hope that any kind of deal is imminent. And in the meantime, this crisis in Gaza continues. The Hamas-run health ministry this morning said that a 6-month-old baby identified as Zainab Abu Khalib died because of severe malnutrition and also a lack of baby formula. It means that at least 10 people have died in Gaza in the last 2 days alone because of malnutrition.
Hugo Bashega. Let's talk to Oliver McTurnan, who's director of Forward Thinking, a UK charity focused on conflict resolution. Thank you for being with us, Oliver. It's a while since we spoke. I just wanted to get your thoughts before we talked about the lack of any ceasefire agreement. Britain saying, the Prime Minister's office just in the last few minutes saying that Britain is taking forward Gaza food airdrop plan. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I would agree very much with everything that was said so far on this bulletin. I think the idea of dropping food from a high distance onto a starving population really puts everyone in Gaza at risk. It's not the answer. And I think the UNRWA chief in saying that it's a distraction is perfectly right.
So it's not the answer. Of course, we've been talking for many months about what should be the answer, a ceasefire agreement. What are your thoughts on the lack of it at any point in the near future when perhaps we thought something might be agreed by the end of this week?
But first of all, Karen, I think the response now is actually a distraction from the fact that Gaza remains an occupied territory. It has been in international law. Now, under the international law, the Geneva Conventions, Israel, as the occupying force, is obliged to protect the civilian population and in particular to provide food and medicine. I think the first step we have to do is actually to hold Israel accountable. And I think anyone who's interested, really interested, and a real friend of Israel would recognize that. To ignore international law is actually putting the country at risk. Of course, moving on to the ceasefire, we do need that, and we do need it immediately. And I think it's not just a temporary ceasefire we need, but a permanent and also a political vision. There's no political vision of what's going to happen to Gaza once you have a ceasefire and the hostage exchange.
You've been in Middle East peace negotiations for around 20 years. How does this current moment compare? Is this perhaps the lowest point as regards any optimism?
I would say so, because we've got an impasse with the negotiations. Now, I think, and I've been saying from the start, that has been well designed, because we've always been focusing on the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu has been under pressure from the far right, in particular Smotrich and Ben-Gvir's party, but also the far right in his own Likud party, to continue the war, because their motive from the start, and they've made it very clear, it's not secret, that was to oversee the depopulation of Gaza. They were hoping the Egyptians would allow them into the Sinai, and then Gaza would become part of the greater Israel from the river to the sea. That's spoken. Now, but also in recent weeks, Netanyahu has been under extreme pressure, I would say, from the ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and the United Judaism, Torah Judaism parties. Both of those parties in the past week have withdrawn from the government. Now, there is an agreement. They're not going to vote against the government in the Knesset. It's Netanyahu, therefore, needed to keep the negotiations going until at least tomorrow, Sunday, when the Knesset goes into a recess for the summer for 2.5 months. In that time, I think he will be working on trying to come to agreement over the draft law for yeshiva students. He'll try and come to agreement with the two Shas and the United Torah Judaism parties. If that happens, or if it doesn't happen, I think he will have to go for elections. If it happens, then it's more likely that he'll then play the game of a temporary ceasefire. But we are in a dark place.
Oliver McTurnan, we must leave it there. Thank you very much for talking to us, former peace negotiator. Now let's go to Scotland. A major security operation has been stepped up on the first full day of President Trump's visit there. He took to his Turnberry golf course in South Ayrshire this morning, while protests are planned in some Scottish cities. During the 5-day visit, he's due to have talks with Sir Keir Starmer, the Scottish First Minister John Swinney and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon sent this report.
Golf, a weekend pursuit for many. But this is the US president, and he's travelled thousands of miles to Scotland to play at one of his courses. This private trip will have politics too. Meetings are tabled with the Prime Minister and also Scotland's First Minister, with plans, the president said on his arrival last night, to talk trade.
We'll have numerous executives that we're meeting with. We're going to be meeting with a lot of people. A lot of people will be staying at Turnberry. And then we're going to Aberdeen, which is the oil capital of Europe, actually.
The European Union is also keen to discuss trade. The European Commission President will be flying in, and the President was asked if he would have any suggestions for his European counterparts.
There's a couple of things I could say, but on immigration, you better get your act together, or you're not going to have Europe anymore.
With a ring of steel, police marksmen and watchtowers around Turnberry, no protesters here, but demonstrations planned for elsewhere, both in Aberdeen and in Edinburgh.
No, he shouldn't be here, and I'm quite disappointed that John Swinney has met with him, actually. I don't think John Swinney should meet with a man like that.
We also want to put pressure on our political leaders to really stand up to Trump's bullying.
One thing is certain, this is looking less like a golfing holiday and more like work for a president who plays by his own rules.
Well, let's go to Turnberry and over to my colleague Rajini Vaidyanathan, who's there. Rajini.
Yeah, as Lorna said in that report there, this is looking more like a work trip than a golfing holiday. Although the president is on the golf course, he's been playing for the last few hours, and we had live shots earlier actually on the news channel where we could see the president getting out of his golf buggy. He's accompanied by Eric Trump, one of his sons as well, and there is no doubt that this is probably one of the most fortified villages in the world at the moment. I speak to you from the edge of the Turnberry property that the president owns. It's behind me in the distance there. The pink roofs you can see there are some of the buildings that he owns and he's staying in for this visit. And there's been a massive police operation, unsurprising of course, given the fact that not only is he the President of the United States, but a president who in the last 12 months survived 2 assassination attempts, one on one of his other golf courses in the United States. Well, to discuss the wider issues around this visit, Lorna, whose report you just saw there, is with me now. Lorna Gordon, our Scotland correspondent. So, Lorna, you've covered previous visits that Donald Trump has made here, not just when he's been president, but also before he won the presidency. How does this one compare?
Yeah, he's visited Scotland several times over the years. You know, remember he has these familial links. His mother was from the Western Isles, from Lewis. He's visited there as well for I think all of about 60 seconds. He visited the family home. And then, of course, 2016, the day after the Brexit vote, and in 2018, when he was actually in that first term in office. And this feels very different, actually, this time around. The security has never been tighter. That, as you mentioned, perhaps in light of that attempted assassination. But I was down for those previous 2 trips when he was here at Turnberry, a resort and a golf course that he bought back in 2014. You know, in previous times they were much more relaxed about access. Yes, you know, it was tight, but there was more access. But this time there is this perimeter fence all the way around, these watchtowers, hundreds of police here, thousands across the country. They are, you know, their role to keep the president safe. Very few protesters seen here. We saw a few last night when the motorcade came in, that large motorcade coming through these small Ayrshire villages. And so some protesters here, but the other thing that strikes me is that there are those protests going on in Aberdeen and Edinburgh. So you still have, this is still a president who divides opinion. But what you are seeing a little bit more on this trip, I think, is alongside the protesters, people coming out to support him as well. And that feels a little bit different than the previous times he's visited Scotland.
Yeah, and I think we can actually bring you some pictures of the protests that have been happening in other parts of Scotland there. You can see there, I'm not sure which city this is, but we know that this is in Edinburgh. Protests there against the visit. But it was striking, as you say, Lorna, that as he landed to Prestwick Airport just outside Glasgow, there were people there to welcome and greet him. I said this yesterday, but he is a Marmite president. People either absolutely love him or they absolutely hate him. Let's talk about the people he's going to be meeting. One of them, Scotland's First Minister, John Swinney, who hasn't been in the favourable camp. He's criticised Mr Trump in the past. He also openly supported Kamala Harris, his opponent in last year's election. Let's talk about how that meeting might go and how it's being seen in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reality of the situation, right? He's the First Minister of Scotland, and Donald Trump is a very important person. It's the realpolitik of it. Whilst he publicly supported Kamala Harris in that US presidential campaign, Donald Trump is the president. He won it. He has to get on with him. And, there are areas that he will want to press him on, those trade issues. I think perhaps in Scotland one of the most relevant is Scotch whisky. The exports that Scotland sends to the US, and he's also he's said publicly he wants to raise the issue of Gaza and the concerns that he has over the situation there, and indeed the concerns of many of those people you've seen out in those protests in Aberdeen and Edinburgh as well.
Indeed, and of course you mentioned Aberdeen there, the President heading to the other coast of Scotland after this weekend to open another golf course there.
Yeah, he has Turnberry, he also has the Many Estate up there, this second golf course that he has opened at Many. This is a site that has been controversial in the past. It was a site of special scientific interest. People who lived there very fond of the sand dunes. They lost that special designation as a result of the course, and Donald Trump talks about it being the oil capital of Europe, but I think that also leads in naturally to the fact one of the things that has really pained him over the years about his golf course up in the northeast is renewable energy. There are wind turbines offshore, or as he likes to call them, windmills. He has raised it in previous trips to Scotland, and you saw it in that wide-ranging press conference when he landed at Prestwick just up the coast here last night. He mentioned those so-called windmills again. He is not a fan of that aspect of renewable energy, more on the side of oil, I think.
Okay, Lorna Gordon, our Scotland correspondent, thank you very much. So as Lorna was saying there, a busy itinerary, but today more of a rest day for the President, but tomorrow he's going to be meeting with the head of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, with him and the EU really pinning their hopes on trying to secure and broker a US-EU trade deal before that August the 1st deadline, which President Trump has set on different countries to try and come up with a deal with the US, or they'd face further tariffs.
Regina, thank you very much. Now it's time for a look at today's sport. It's over to Mark Benstead. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Karen. The British and Irish Lions have won the second test and in turn the series against Australia after a thrilling encounter in Melbourne. It finished 29-26 to the Lions, but only after a 79th minute Hugo Keenan try. The Wallabies had led 23-17 at half-time after a much improved showing from that in Brisbane. The pressure is off the tourists now, having secured an unassailable lead in the series. Former Lion Matt Dawson believes the squad can take satisfaction, but will focus on clinching a whitewash next week.
We don't want to drown any of the celebrations tonight because it's going to be big for the Lions, but at some stage there will be perspective about who the Lions were up against and the quality of the opposition. And they're going to take the win. You can only play and beat the sides in front of you, and the Lions have done it well. Were the Lions tested to the max over these two matches? Probably not. But saying that, they had to dig deep, and I didn't think that the Lions were going to have to dig as deep as they did today. I certainly didn't see Australia going 23-5 up, and we had to see a different mentality from this Lions side. So all credit to those Lions, but I'm not so sure whether they will be celebrating as hard as maybe if they win 3-0 next weekend.
On to cricket and another test series that could be won today. England are hoping to build on the big lead against India in the fourth test at Old Trafford. England were all out for 669 and that gave them a lead of 311. In response, things started terribly for India. They were 0 for 2 after losing both Jaswal and Sud Hassan. They have steadied the ship slightly though. They're now 27 for 2. Max Verstappen has won the sprint race at the Belgium Grand Prix, marking a winning start for Red Bull under new team principal Laurent Mekies. Verstappen passed McLaren's Oscar Piastri on the first lap and maintained his advantage. Piastri's second-place finish means he has moved 1 point further ahead of Lando Norris in the championship, with qualifying for Sunday's Grand Prix on the way. On to football, and Newcastle United manager Eddie Howe says settling Alexander Isak's future has to be right for the club. Isak did not travel with the squad to Singapore on Thursday, with Newcastle saying he had a thigh injury. The Sweden international wants to look at a move. Liverpool are reportedly interested.
Of course, there's things going on behind the scenes. I mean, he will be aware he's in the news every day, and I'm sure that's not easy for anyone in that situation. Conversations that happen between Alex and the club, or Alex and myself, will stay private for obvious reasons. We do share a really good relationship with him. He's been magnificent for us for as long as he's joined. He's very popular in the dressing room, as I've said before. Would love him to continue his journey at Newcastle, and I think all I would say on the broader picture is whatever happens has to be right for Newcastle.
And England and Spain are making their final preparations for Sunday's European Championship final in Basel. England's women are hopeful Lauren James will be fit, and she has been involved in training. England are looking to make a successful defence of the trophy that they won 3 years ago under Sarina Wiegman. And that's all your sport for now. There's more on the BBC Sport website, including all the latest from the penultimate stage of the Tour de France.
Thank you. Now, pubs in England and Wales will be able to stay open for longer tomorrow for England's Euro final against Spain. Licensing hours have been extended to allow premises to keep serving until 1 a.m. The Lionesses, as we've just been seeing, have been taking part in their final training session in Zurich ahead of Sunday's game. Our sports editor Dan Rowan has more from there.
Well, the encouraging news for the manager, Sarina Wiegman, Karen, is that all 23 of her players trained a short while ago here in Zurich in their final session before they make the short journey to Basel from their base that they've been at for the last month later on today. There has been a question mark over forward Lauren James, but as you can see, she showed no ill effects from the slight ankle injury that she picked up in the semi-final against Italy this week. She had to come off at half-time, and yesterday Wiegman admitted that she didn't know whether or not she would be fit enough to start in the final tomorrow, but the signs from this morning's session were good. These no longer, of course, are unusual occasions for England. They were in the final of the last Euros 3 years ago. They won that, of course. The year later, they were in the World Cup final. They lost that to their opponents tomorrow, Spain, and so this is a chance to make amends for that. It's a mouth-watering prospect. Two very evenly matched teams. Both have beaten each other already this season. And, of course, the added motivation for England is that if they can prevail tomorrow in this match, it'll be the first time that a senior England team in either men's or women's football has won a major title overseas or indeed retained a major title. So when the squad leave here later on today, they'll have a huge amount to aim for tomorrow.
Dan Rowan. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has threatened to block the EU's new 7-year budget unless Brussels unlocks funding for Budapest. The EU suspended payments in response to Hungary's policies on migration, LGBT rights and democratic institutions. An ally of President Putin, Mr. Orbán also accused Brussels of plotting to install a pro-Ukraine and pro-EU government in Hungary after next year's elections, when he'll face his strongest challenger yet of his 16 years in office. Let's talk to our Hungary correspondent Nick Thorpe in Budapest. And Nick, how determined is Mr. Orban to block this budget?
Well, I think this was a useful kind of element of his speech. This is his annual speech when he maps out his plans, policies for the next year. So clearly, it's a strong threat. That said, the EU budget's only just been unveiled by Ursula von der Leyen on Wednesday, and we're now going to have 2 years of tough negotiations. Actually, Hungary would have until 2027 to veto that, or not to, or to negotiate on it. So it's actually a little bit early to be talking about vetoing it, but obviously it sounded good to his supporters today.
And Nick, tell us about this accusation he's made that Brussels is plotting to install a pro-Western government in Hungary after next year's elections.
Well, this is interesting. Actually, today was a day, Karen, of two big speeches. Mr. Orban's in Romania at the Summer University, and Péter Magyar, the leader of the opposition Tisza party, who gave a big speech in the western Hungarian city of Székesfehérvár, close to where I am now. So while Mr. Magyar, the opposition leader, he's really emerged from nowhere to challenge Orban. So they have two very different visions of the EU. Mr. Orban, as it were, always challenging, almost sabotaging effectively EU policy, whereas Péter Magyar saying that he wants Hungary, a strong Hungary within a strong EU and a strong NATO.
Nick, thank you very much. Nick Thorpe there in Western Hungary, not in Budapest, as I introduced Nick. As there is so much more on our website, live pages on several stories, updated minute by minute. Do stay with us here on BBC News.